Right, welcome along, folks, to another kind of Rugby World Cup preview chat. I am joined today by Paul Tait from the America's Rugby News. Paul, man, how's it going?
Going well, thanks, Mark. What about you?
Yeah, man, good. Going to pick up the kids from school shortly. Thanks for making some time. I know it's kind of getting a wee bit late in the evening for you over in Brazil, right?
Correct. Yeah, I think we're on a 15-hour time difference to you guys, so it's about 10 p.m. here.
How's the Rugby World Cup looking for you in terms of like viewing times? Because New Zealand, some of them are great and some of them are horrendous.
Pretty good. So Chile is going to be playing at 8 a.m.,
That's
but
okay.
that's the earliest. So most matches are something like 11, 1 p.m. or 4 p.m. So Uruguay, France is 4 p.m. on a Thursday.
Okay, so it's kind of work day, but still.
Right.
Okay. Now, people may or may not know your name. I've mentioned it certainly a few times in some videos. Those particular videos would be the sometimes controversial, but generally always very well viewed foreign-born, homegrown player videos. I remember back in 2018, I tried to prep one on my own. It was a little bit muddled and had a few errors in it. And then I think about 6 months later, I discovered you've got a much more detailed list of kind of all the players coming in and out of the squads. Are they qualifying through their teams through residency? Is it a grandparent? Like which teams are kind of chock full of homegrown talent? Which teams are tending to kind of import more of the talent? How much work goes into this thing, man? I mean, I can pop it up on screen just briefly for people to have a look, but there's huge profiles about like all of these World Cup teams. I'll put a link in the description for it. But yeah, man, like how much work goes into finding out that Jordan Uelese was born in New Zealand, went through the Australian system and qualified for Australia via residency in 2011. It's very specific.
Exactly. Look, obviously it's a lot, but just to be objective about it all, that's the way it has to be. So the entire point of this was to basically clarify who the players are, what they're doing playing in the World Cup. So the purpose, hopefully, is that the reader can make his or her own conclusions, hopefully objectively, of course. So certain teams are straightforward, and there's vast online ease in terms of access to their information, like very well documented. Like all rugby's are excellent source for some certain teams. Wikipedia is pretty good for certain teams, but not.
I use All Rugby like religiously. That is a fantastic website for seeing which players have played for which teams and how many minutes did they play. Like I love that stats stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And for player transfers, I think it's the best anywhere.
Yeah.
So for certain teams, it was not a problem. Never has been. But for example, for Georgia, Romania, Tonga, Samoa, it's a bit of a mix. So the person known as @T2 Rugby on Twitter, he helped tremendously with these guys. So, for example,
I love that guy's Twitter account. Like he's got some great insights of the game, which just tend to go under the radar. Like recently, this is a bit off topic, but he was talking about the amount of players who are going to be at this World Cup who play there like for their job, like their club rugby they play in France. When like a lot of the media narrative tends to be about these big bad French clubs who don't release players for their international teams, but so many of the tier 2 players who play rugby as a job have been given that opportunity in France.
Oh, absolutely, and I agree with him. And I've actually known him in the virtual world, so to speak, since before the 2011 World Cup. Right. And for example, there was a guy who was Fijian, and he said, this is before, probably 10 days before the World Cup in France the last time. He said if Fiji make it out of their group, it's because of the French leagues. And so now we're at the point where it's Georgia. So if Georgia can win a couple of matches, basically it's going to be predominant, not entirely because they've got the Black Lion, of course, but French teams are the exposure for these guys. And so it has been a real game changer, certainly for Fiji and Argentina in the last time it was in France. And let's see what it was going to unfold this time. But it certainly is unparalleled in rugby in terms of just how big it is, the amount of money there, and what it can do to teams. So, I mean, he talked about Adrian Motok. He told me about the Romanian player. He's French born, and I found out that he told me that, well, his father was a professional from Romania, so they actually moved home when he's 5 years old, and then he went back as a professional. So therefore he is Romanian produced. And another guy is Georgi. I can't pronounce it. I'm sorry, but Georgi.
The one Georgian guy who was like foreign produced. The guy who.
Correct.
Yes, I've read your article.
Right. So it's kind of the opposite. So his father went there to Sharon to play pro rugby. Family went along, so he got there as a 9-year-old. And went on from there to so he's a French product, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I mean, I would not have found that on myself by myself.
Right.
Portugal is another example. So their union websites not so helpful. Getting access to their players is pretty tough. I just networked to some people I know who are Brazilians or Portuguese, so
sure,
that was it. I asked if they knew, and got the response really quick. And this was with the initial roster that they had, and one of the players didn't make it, and I talked to T2 about it before it happened, and he was spot on in terms of who would make the World Cup. So definitely follow him if you're not already.
Yeah.
Japan was a bit complex because
so many residency cases with Japan, but it's a weird one that I kind of wanted to touch on as well, because my initial scanning of your article about which teams have kind of got the most like imported players, like Japan's always one that comes to mind. Like when I'm talking to my mum, she'll watch the Japanese team and go, you know, with her hands on her hips, like so many of those guys aren't Japanese, like shaking her head. But then when you look at your article, a lot of those guys have been in Japan for a long time.
Right. So there are 4 or 5 who were aged 14 to 15. So you've got to ask the question, when do they become homegrown? So if they move at that age, do they? Well, yes, I say they do. What if they're 16 or 17? Well, now with the 5 years residency, you say no. Prior, when it was 3 years, it's also a case of, well, yeah, it's a hard one. You can argue either way at about that age. But yeah, Japan certainly are a case wherein you can't just say, oh, they're foreign born. They're not Japanese. Let's look deep and find out who they all are. Chile and Uruguay were actually a little tough.
Really?
Yes, because there's nothing out there. You can't just Google the name. Even using Spanish I can speak Portuguese and Spanish, so that really is why I'm able to do it, I think, for these countries anyway. So Baltazar Amaya is from Argentina. This was confirmed with an interview I found. It actually didn't take long at all. But again, speaking Spanish matters, basically. And with the Chileans, we always knew of one who was born in Peru because his parents were there. He was there for a matter of days. And then we found out about a second Chilean player is actually from Sao Paulo, and Brazilians didn't know about it. So I was telling some people last week about it, and they were like, "Oh man, we're going to have one of our guys in the World Cup." So
nice, they're represented.
Right. So I messaged one of their players, flanker, Clemente Saavedra, and said, "Hey, do you happen to know if Matias Garafulic was born in Brazil?" Because and he confirmed it. So that was really fast. Yeah.
So you're really having to exploit that network of yours to dig down into where all these guys were born. But from memory, those guys they went back to their like home country for the purposes of growing up and learning their rugby, right?
Right. So they're all Chileans. I mean, and Clemente made the point saying, saying to me, made sure that I understood what he thought, which is that this guy's Chilean.
Yeah. Despite where
look,
he was born, it's like Akira
right,
Ioane. Not that he made the All Blacks, he was born in
right,
Japan, but no one's saying, "Hey, he's Japanese."
right. So I mean, the guy's 2 years old, and his brother,
Yeah,
of course, is also in the World Cup
yeah,
roster, and he's older. He's born in Santiago. So, like, these
mm,
guys are. I mean, listen to them talk.
yeah.
His Spanish is Chilean
Right.
100%. So,
Okay, you can tell
yeah,
by the accent.
exactly.
Yeah. Now it's an interesting one because, like I said at the initial piece, like the feedback on these whenever we talk about this topic seems to be like higher than normal. Like I've literally made thousands of rugby videos, and the most viewed one ever is the foreign-born players 2019
Mm.
video, which was using your data from the last World Cup, and it's such a mixed bag of people saying, "Look, I don't care. I don't care with like about any of the stuff." Which begs the
Hmm.
question: why you're watching the video if you
Hmm.
didn't care about it? And then people who will like, yeah, everyone's got a different take on it. Like, oh, if it's a blood connection, that's fine. Or
Hmm.
3 years residency was more than enough. No, 5 years residency is not long enough. It should be 10 years residency. Like, why do you think there is just so much like always like drama and I don't know, like contention about this topic?
Yeah. Well, 2 points, I guess. First is whose interest is being attended to. Are we talking about the individual? Are we talking about the global game? And second, I think it's important to note that international rugby eligibility, I think it depends on what you think you know about it. So you can make a subjective observation, which is kind of, you've touched on. So, for example, I'm happy with the players; they represent me, their eligibility, no rules are broken. End of story.
Mm,
Or an objective observation, maybe different, maybe something like, well, teams are being disqualified from World Cup qualifying, and in fact from World Cups. And yes, some teams benefit, but how many and how do they benefit? So I think foreign born is a bit. It's not. Well, it's lumping everyone together, which is the problem.
mm,
So again, a player is born in Tonga, but he moved as a 2-year-old. What about someone who's born in Tonga and moved to Australia or New Zealand as a 18-year-old? Well, are they the
mm,
same? No, they're not. They're
mm,
not. The New Zealand or Australian system had a lot to do with how the player became who he is today in one case, but not in the other case. So look, one can believe that everything's fine. That's okay. If they're happy, that's fine. Similarly, one can believe that there's nothing wrong. Again, if they're happy with the eligibility, that's okay. But the present World Cup and past campaigns, are we just going to forget about what has happened? So it's a hot button issue because there's no universal agreement, and people can be for or against, and the eligibility laws benefit some, but they do harm others, and that's undisputable. That's if you look at the data, I think that's the conclusion. And I'm not talking about teams being disqualified. Just look at the rosters again, and can you find a correlation between how the roster is made up and a country's clubs and the rankings? I mean, are teams rewarded who are doing things right? And look, this is precisely what Uruguay's coach Esteban Menezes, he asked several weeks ago. Be sure, by the way, to follow Ignacio Chance, read his work. So Menezes, he's adamant that Uruguay and Georgia are doing things right, but are punished, for example, with Tonga free to cap All Blacks and Wallabies. So Uruguay
mm.
faced Tonga last November. 10 New Zealanders started for Tonga, 4 All Blacks. So is the voice of people like Menezes being heard? So look, it's a multifaceted equation. The work on foreign players, basically trying to document prior representation to see who is homegrown and who is not. I think it's vital to differentiate between foreign born and homegrown for this reason.
Mm. I feel like the South American voice doesn't make its way into the media over here very much. Like most of the eligibility, like the change that allows like people to change their nationality, it was mainly seen as a positive over here. I feel like there has to be a connection to what we saw here in New Zealand anyway from rugby league, when a bunch of big name rugby league players switched allegiance from New Zealand to Tonga, and then the support they got was incredible. Like, I live in Auckland, and there was just people lining the streets. There were houses covered in flags, and the Tongan team, with a bunch of kind of former New Zealand internationals, went on and had this remarkable campaign, and there was a real groundswell of support for them. So I can't help, maybe I'm being a little bit cynical, but I feel like that people took notice of that and was like, wow, if we can get big name players to switch from if they're not All Blacks anymore, to switch to Tonga, then we can maybe combat this league support or replicate what kind of success they had. So the eligibility law change thing was kind of seen as a positive, and that you're going to get the best players playing at the World Cup, and that's going to attract the most spectators. But it sounds like, from what you're saying, in South American countries like Uruguay and whatnot, it maybe wasn't seen in quite the same light.
No, well, so it's presented by those who push for the change as an aid for the tier 2 to help close the gap, if you will. So it sounds good. But is it really good? Well, who benefits? So, I mean, Samoa and Tonga, yes, they're primary benefactors. Namibia have got Richard Hardwick. Romania have gotten, how do I pronounce his name? Georgi Gajon from Moldova. South Africa voted no, but they've gotten John Klein from Ireland, who is, of course, that's a player returning. Scotland have gotten
Dempsey.
Jack Dempsey. Wales have gotten Henry Thomas. So is this a tier 2 gain we're looking at or not? Because okay, Namibia got 1, Romania got 1, but Romania are up against Tonga, who've gotten a lot more than that. Samoa have gotten more than the lower ranked Namibia again, and Romania. So South Africa, Scotland, and Wales. So Uruguay are not getting anybody. Georgia are not getting anybody. Chile are not getting anybody. Portugal are not. Japan are not getting anybody. So, in fact, Georgia and Portugal have faced Wales at this World Cup with Henry Thomas. Okay. Wales faced Namibia with a Wallaby. So, okay. It's more than not gaining. It's basically showing what Menezes was talking about as being the reality from this perspective of the South American team. So again, like, what about Chile? No gain, but they play against Samoa. So it could be against All Blacks like Charlie Famuina, Stephen Luatua, Lima Sopoaga, Sevens players, Ben Lam, Fritz Lee, Wallabies. So Christian Lealifano, Duncan Paia'awa, is that correct?
That's
His
right.
name. So who is Samoa legitimately getting back from these players? So one of them are homegrown. So Fritz Lee is legitimately returning to Samoa, but the other players they're eligible for Samoa now, but they're not actually returning. They're making the eligibility change as players who are actually not from there. So again, if imagine you're a Chilean supporter or player, yeah, you might not be too happy. So what about Romania? Well, again, you're going to be up against Jack Dempsey. So, okay, that's pretty hard when considering Romania's disqualification last time. Against Georgia, well, Fekatoa, Fifita, they are returning home. Absolutely, returning home. They are homegrown Tongans. But Tongans are also going to get Adam Coleman, George Moala, Charles Piatau, Pitaaki, Augustine Pulu. So, I mean, these are not the same kind of thing of players returning. They are Tongan by heritage.
Right.
So, Fiji, well, the roster does not include any transfers.
Yeah, so it was interesting. Fiji had a bunch of guys that they could have picked up who have played for other nations who would have been eligible for Fiji, but their roster is largely homegrown guys with a couple of guys who played in like New Zealand and Australia and I think one from England.
Exactly. So like Fiji is, we need to be careful and clear about this. Fiji are not to be categorized as the Pacific Islands, like they're all three as the same, because they're not.
It happens a lot. They get lumped into the same boat, but I think population-wise, economy-wise, they're different kettles of fish, and clearly rugby-wise, they're in
Yeah.
in way different positions. So, I mean, you touched on Chile and Uruguay. Like, those are not traditional rugby markets, and they don't
Mhm.
have access to foreign players to bring in. I mean, a lot of the tier 2 countries I've seen, like even the ones that didn't make the World Cup, like I know the US and Canada,
Mhm.
leaned on getting a few guys who, like were born in Europe, or whatever, had an American parent or something like that.
Right.
But Uruguay and Chile, they're breeding these players at home. Like, what's the deal? How are they? Well, what are they doing right? That maybe, if we're saying that, like, getting players to come. Personally, I feel like homegrown is, in terms of longevity,
Mhm.
a probably a wiser way to go. Like, for the sustainability of the game. Like, what are these teams doing right?
Well, what happened was Uruguay were cleanly beaten by Romania in the 2011 World Cup qualifiers, and Limoni was involved. He's now Chile's coach. He was Uruguay's coach for 2015, and like he was in tears. And they realized, and they admitted after that, we're not gonna play in the World Cup again. We've got to change everything, because they were amateurs. So they worked starting in 2013. They worked with local government to get Stadio Charrua, which is their national ground. Anyone in Montevideo visiting, go there, have a look for yourself. It's great. So it's got high performance facilities there, and that was the game changer for everything. So they qualified for the World Cup by beating Russia, and Russia won at home the first game narrowly, but then Uruguay won the key match to qualify. And after that happened, it was celebration, but it's like, we're going to be playing against England in England, Wales in Wales, also Australia in this World Cup, and Fiji. I mean, the last time we played England in the World Cup, look what happened. It was a 100-point hiding. So from there, they had little time, but the high performance took off. Players stopped work so they could train. That was it. Then along came the America's Rugby Championship after the World Cup, so 2016 to 2019. Chile, during this World Cup cycle, were getting hammered. They went from always beating to Brazil to now losing. They were now losing to the US by over 60 points, sometimes 70-point losses. So Chile, the same thing happened basically as Uruguay. They said, look, this ain't right. We deserve better. And so they made the plans starting in 2020 to be high performance 2. And they did so with basically getting their players age 24 and under, and making them the players who would be the pro players and the test players, with the goal of qualifying for 2027. So they actually qualified earlier than they had
one
set
World Cup
themselves.
earlier.
Right. And Canada's in disarray, so that's part of the problem.
That helps for South America anyway.
Exactly. So and the US had a number of issues that remain, but hopefully they have turned the corner with their win over Romania. Let's wait and find out.
Yeah. So is that the kind of model that other places could implement? I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward. I can't imagine that the player pools they've got access to in Uruguay and Chile is massive. It sounds like they've kind of targeted it very specifically and carefully.
Exactly. So both countries have the capital as the hotbed, so to speak. That's where the test players are essentially, not all of them, but like in both countries, you've got all but 4 or 5 of them are from the capitals. So the clubs in those regions are dominant. So that helps a lot. Like, that's one of the problems that Canadians have mentioned. Oh, we're not centralized, but that's part of it. But the professional model of Super Rugby Americas, look, it does work. So Paraguay, Brazil, they're two that could make this work for them. The difference is that Chile has a vastly superior junior system, and this has always been the case. So when Brazil were winning in the America's Rugby Championship years, it was a case of, well, the junior system still is not good. So what's going to happen? Is this going to be long term or not? So as as we have seen, Brazil are now behind Chile, have been throughout the cycle, and Paraguay have actually caught up to them. So Paraguay have kind of got a combination of the Chile model. They have their own high performance center, their own venue, but Chilean stadium or rugby venue, whatever you want to call it, it's under construction now. So Uruguay's already got their own one. But so when Paraguay played, they had their first game, which was Olympia Lions, the Naco Yacare. So when they had their first match, there were no Paraguayans involved. So you actually had players you had a Namibian player who's going to be at the World Cup who played. So you had lots of Argentines, for example, involved, even Fijians involved. But now they're able to have half or more of their players as Paraguayans playing in Super Rugby Americas. So yeah, it's doing. I think there's no question that it's working. It's just it's not going to be so instant as Chile, as an example. But Colombia, for example, pulled out, and they went from beating Paraguay comfortably now being beaten comfortably. So very important to get this right.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Is that the kind of thing, though, that because I mean it doesn't sound like rocket science. And one thing, if we look at the other end of the scale in terms of the homegrown situation, like when we looked at Samoa and Tonga, how so many of their players are imported. I mean, is it a financial step? I mean, I don't know if you know this, but like, what is it that's missing? Because in the Pacific Islands, it's certainly not the players. And I know they've set up Moana Pacifica here in New Zealand to be like this sixth team, but it's largely made up of, you know, Kiwis who maybe didn't get into the other 5 Super Rugby franchises. So I don't know. In your opinion, is this the kind of thing that if there's the money they can implement in the Pacific?
Yeah. So do you know how many homegrown Tongans play for Moana Pacifica?
Was it none?
Well, T2, he provided the answer. The answer is that there were 37 of the 43 players were players raised in New Zealand, 3 in Australia, and 1 from Fiji, 1 from Samoa, and 1 from Tonga. So yeah, so the model of the team is very different than the South American professional teams. I'm not going to say whether that's a good thing or not, but ideally, having on-island players involved for Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, that would be great. I think everyone can agree on that. I mean, it's just one of those things. Like Scotland have got a World Cup Wallaby now. Wales, former England prop. So let's just go back at Tonga, analyze Tonga, for example, quickly. So they've got wins over France and Italy at World Cups, but they've got losses against Canada and Georgia at World Cups. It was 102-0 against New Zealand the last time. I mean, was that Armageddon? I mean, I don't think so. I think the reality is that Tonga often accept matches and just that they don't have the time for it, or they can't get the players for it. So it's unfortunate. But look, Tonga recovered from losing to Canada in the World Cup to beating France in the same World Cup. Think about that. And I mean, Georgia defeated the Tongans in 2015, but they almost lost to Namibia in the same World Cup again. So, yeah, I mean, getting every country has their own structures, so to speak. On island,
one size doesn't always fit all, I guess. But I don't know. I just I saw there's the story of Miracle Failangi, who was I think the first Samoan born and raised player to represent Moana Pacifica, and now he's gone on ahead and made the Samoan squad. And I'm like, that's what that's what I think seems like right. That's what it should be. It should be the pathway for the guys who are on island to get a chance to play high level rugby, and then see what they can do on the international side. That just feels like that makes sense.
Right. So, I mean, how, for example, did Uruguay beat Fiji last World Cup? Well, I mean, it was a homegrown Uruguayan team. They're all Uruguayan. They played smart. Their tactics were very good, of course. But it was a high performance investments. That's what worked. And they worked so hard. It was extremely hard work what they did. the one with the tiny player base. I mean, smaller player base than Fiji, smaller than Samoa, and smaller than Tonga. Okay. So small population, it's part of the equation. So Uruguay is about 3.4 million, something like that. What is New Zealand now? 5?
5, yeah.
Yeah.
Tonga and Samoa are in the hundreds of thousands.
Right. I think Fiji's still under 1 million. So
it's roundabout or in that neighborhood, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, for instance, how did Fiji beat England in the warm-ups? I mean, they didn't have All Blacks, they didn't have Wallabies. So, I mean, yeah.
Well, it's interesting with the Drua, like so much of that Fijian squad is made up of the Fijian Drua. And I've seen Simon Raiolui, their coach, on Twitter, like when they've bandied out the idea of like, would a Super Rugby draft work? Because, you know, the Crusaders are so dominant. People are banding about ideas like, how do you spread the talent among the teams so it's more even? And then that begs the question, like, well, would Australian teams be able to draft New Zealand players and things like that? And then he comes out and basically says, look, for us, a draft wouldn't work because what we want is to have this kind of centralized system here in Fiji where these guys are playing for the Drua and the pathway is, you know, to play for the Flying Fijians. So, yeah, a draft for them would not meet what they see the purpose of the Fijian Drua as being.
Absolutely. Look, this is a commonality. Fiji, the Drua, Uruguay with Peñarol. Uruguay, the other point is the Sevens team was on the world circuit this past season, and they were competitive. They got good wins over Great Britain, for example. And the World Cup roster gained from it because people like the problem Shaguares had was only one team. Can't get game time for everybody, and they refuse to pick from abroad.
True.
So Uruguay, they do pick from abroad, of course, and they had notable players involved, like Alonso was involved in Sevens instead of Peñarol this season, for example. So when we were looking at who Uruguay were probably going to take to the World Cup, we were scratching our heads. Are they going to take the Sevens players? Because I mean, Georgia, okay, they have Black Lion. That they toured South America this year. So we had Salkman versus Black Lion. It was 33-30 to the Georgian team.
Wow.
All Georgians on one side, all Chileans on the other side. Okay.
That's cool.
Yeah. So Chile, they actually say that they're Martin Seegert, captain, he said that they are 30 years behind. So that's what they're facing. This is the challenge they're facing. They've got a high performance program now. It has seen them catching up a lot. Like they caught Canada, they caught the US, but now they've got the World Cup. So, I mean, look, their high performance program, it's been vital, but the eligibility law change has not made it better for them. I mean, just look at the Battle of the South Pacific. We're going to see in the World Cup, Samoa against Chile as an example. Yeah. And, I mean, I already touched on it, but do you recall that match, the All Blacks Tonga match? From
yeah, I mean, the 102 one I seem to remember was during. There was a couple of games. I went to one right before the 2019 Rugby World Cup where Tonga played the All Blacks in a warm up, and it was a horrendously high scoreline. And then we played them when COVID restrictions were still a thing, and Tonga kind of had to field a team of guys like who were just in New Zealand because New Zealand's borders were still not freely open. You had to go through quarantine to come in. Not many of the Tongan guys based in Europe came back. I feel like because they would have had to pay their own way. I think it was only Takalua, the captain, the halfback, who was like that, like keen to represent Tonga. That, you know, he was like, no, I'm going to take time off from my club. I'm going to pay for my flight. I'm going to pay for the 2 weeks quarantine, which, you know, I have to foot the bill for, and I'm going to represent Tonga. And then they got absolutely destroyed. So, yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask you about is like with the eligibility changes and whatnot. Like, it's one thing I worry a little bit about. Like, it's easy enough to get guys to play in a World Cup because everybody wants to play in a World Cup. But when it's the kind of like the less glamorous tournaments, like if it's the Pacific Nations Cup, are we going to see some of the big guns maybe not choose to play? I mean, I guess it'll come down to personal preference and what the unions can organize for them. Are they going to get paid? It's always a problem.
Yeah, I would suspect that, because the player to begin with already has the choice. So now it's a case of, well, I've tried that and they don't want me anymore. Let's give it a go. Got nothing to lose. I think it's highly connected though to just how rugby is operated. I mean, why is the Pacific Nations Cup the big thing? Why is there no Oceania or real Pacific Cup with All Blacks playing a match in Suva, for example? So when are we going to be having that conversation seriously? You know, the 2014 World Cup, that could have happened already, hasn't. I'm yet to see a strong argument against it. I can argue for it all day long, but getting everything normalized, it's vital. We don't have a global season. How can we make that happen? So getting structure, and I'm not talking about something like the Nations Championship, for example. Soccer is a model which rugby needs to learn from. It's that simple. So just to give you some idea, here, Brazil obviously is always in the World Cup.
Sure.
And it's a big deal when they play the qualifiers, but they always qualify.
Right.
But it's a big deal. People are watching Brazil play Bolivia, Brazil play Venezuela, Brazil play Paraguay. So, I mean, New Zealand, they're going to qualify every time. But if we can make something meaningful from it, that will help a lot. And that'll help Tonga more than you can imagine, because being able then to restructure the calendar properly, because it's total madness that we don't have a global season. But that's just the way it is. Yeah.
So you think there could be some kind of like World Cup qualifying campaign which involves all the teams? Is that how it works in football, soccer?
Oh, they all have to qualify. Only Qatar didn't qualify. Yeah. So imagine only France qualified. So
yeah,
there you go.
That makes that's just like there's nothing more juicy than when there's something on the line, right? So yeah, okay. No, I've never heard that idea suggested before, but because everyone just the top 3 teams always qualify from the pools, and it's all the bottom qualifiers that have to go through the kind of rigmarole of qualifying for their own little placements. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I can't talk about the foreign players and the squads without bringing up New Zealand, because you see New Zealand always gets. Anytime I do a video about like the Six Nations squads, there'll always be like a dozen comments saying, "Oh, that's all well and good, but what about New Zealand? How many players of New Zealand, stolen from Tonga and Samoa and Fiji and whatnot?" So the New Zealand numbers, they kind of, I had a look at them. They seemed about normal, a little bit higher in terms of foreign born, but not too many that were trained abroad.
Yeah, I mean. The whole concept, well, people move because of economic necessities. Look, and of course, people move. It's normal. Yeah. But let's talk. So Toby Faletau, he's Welsh. The late Jerry Collins, he was a New Zealand rugby product. They moved as children. We know where they're from. But the systems which made them the players that they are not where they were born. Let's be clear. So World Rugby, Alan Gilpin, who's the CEO, so he argued that after the changes had been confirmed, that this was not a Pacific Islands measure. So he said Uruguay can get players back, which is false. So however, the law change was in part argued as helping the third world. So this argument was made. But after the change, I mean, South Americans, you can imagine, they were very angry. Dan Leo, who was behind the move, he argued that third world needs assistance. But so Ignacio Chance responded to him on Twitter saying, "We're third world too." So, I mean, Uruguay, yes, a third world, that's a fact. I know a guy who was from the Spanish rugby community who it was a pleasure reading his ideas, but he left Twitter. He just got tired. And it was related to what happened. He thought it was just appalling. There's a guy from Panama who I follow. His name is Juan Maron. He said something basically that the wishes of a population of a few 100,000 had been attended to against the wishes of a population of 425 million South Americans. So he said this was very short-sighted. So talk about the late Jerry Collins for a second. I mean, he played against the Lions in 2005. So that tour, you had UK journalist Stephen Jones. He called New Zealand the Island Raiders. He said it was the 4 lions against the 4 countries from the Pacific. So New Zealand had Mills Malaina, Tana Umanga, Ma'anono, Kavamialamo, Jerry Collins, Rodney Soyalo, Sitivini Sitovatu, and who else? Rokethoko. No, he was injured, I think. And the late Sione Lawaki. So, Mark, you maybe know the answer to this. Who of these players were pillaged from the Pacific? Was Nonu? Was Umanga? Was Mialamo?
I feel like Sivi Vatu came here kind of late, but I think all the others not so much.
Right. He was 15 years old when he moved.
Right. Okay. Even that's not too bad. 15. What was I doing when I was 15? Yeah.
So Malayan is 3 years old when he moved. And I mean, and so the article which got published and obviously influenced people called the All Blacks the Raiders of the Pacific. So, I mean, of the foreign-born All Blacks from that Lions tour, I mean, you could maybe say Sitivini Sitovatu isn't New Zealand rugby product. He's from Fiji.
15 is kind of borderline, 15, right?
Exactly. I agree. But yeah, so Tonga's roster now, it's got Solomon Kata. So he finished high school in New Zealand. It's got Fikato, it's got Fifita. They moved on scholarships to finish school. So those 2 guys, they played for the All Blacks, but they're not homegrown. So yes, that's correct. But yeah, homegrown, I think it helps differentiate, for example, Toby Faletau from Jack Dempsey or Marcus Smith from James Lowe. So very important, I think. So the Japanese roster, if you look at just the foreign-born numbers, it's about 51. Yeah, it's just over half. But let's look at who they are. So you got players who are 14 or 15, like Michael Leach, Warner Deans, Guji Wan, Valu. These guys they moved at that age. So basically, if you look at it, it's towards 2/3 are homegrown.
Right. They had their formative years in Japan kind of thing.
Right. So the equation's more complex when you factor more things in than simply foreign-born. So I think it's very helpful to look at who they are, to determine also which countries are benefiting, which are not.
How about the guys in the UK? Because the UK viewers often give me a bit of feedback that like you can't talk about the UK the same way you talk about like other countries, because movement in the UK is so easy. You might live in a district of Wales where your local hospital is actually across the border in England. So you could technically be born in England, but still have Welsh parents who live in Wales. And I imagine, like, I've never been there, but like I know, because there's free movement also between Australia and New Zealand. A lot of Kiwis moved to work in Australia, so it didn't surprise me when I saw the Australian squad that there are several born in New Zealand guys who are raised in Australia. So for the UK, is it fair to kind of lump them into the same boat as everybody else?
There are definitely ties which are there's uniquely British or UK equation for sure. But having said that, it's mixed, because how many of the England players are from Scotland? How many are from Wales? How many of the Welsh players are from Scotland? Okay, so while there's movement, the homegrown data basically shows you, look, there are differences. So you've got to remember that union scout players, okay, they're full-time professionals. It's their job to precisely identify someone who's eligible, and then see if we're going to want him or not. So Johnny Williams, Nick Tompkins, they're not from Wales. They did not go through the Welsh system. They were England under 20 players. One of them actually played for England.
Against the Barbars, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Wales wanted more centers and went after them. It was within the rules. So again, so you can say there's nothing wrong with that if you want to. So Wales does have players who moved really young, and Wales also has heritage players. Scotland has heritage players with a range of ties. For example, Redpath is the son of a Scotland captain.
His example is so weird. Son of a Scotland captain, but he's like born in France and then like raised in the UK. So he's like all over
Right.
the shop.
Exactly. So, I mean, he played for England under 20s. But that's just one example of a guy who's obviously extremely well connected to Scotland. But then what about the Wallaby playing for them? So he does not qualify by place of birth or by where he grew up or by his mom or dad. He qualifies through a grandparent. So again, while there is definitely intertwining, the net has been spread far beyond the UK. So professional players have moved from Super Rugby as adults from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, and they're playing for the home nations at the World Cup as a result.
What about Spain? I want to touch on Spain before we wrap up, because I know Spain for another World Cup now have been disqualified. I don't know what Spain seems to be like a little bit of a hotbed for rugby, like with the potential to kind of blossom, but it can't be helping things to get.
No.
Like, I mean, the thing that they're aiming for at a country at that level is like to get to the World Cup is like for some other countries to win the World Cup, right? It's just like such that thing to celebrate as the pinnacle of some of these guys' careers, and they get disqualified for, was it Van der Berg, the South African guy? He appeared for a few minutes and was at one or two of the games, and that in isolation doesn't seem like wrong. I'm sure you broke the rules and then you get disqualified. But from what I read from your article, there's a Romanian situation which was kind of similar. And then in the past, there's been when things were a lot looser, tier 1 teams have kind of done the same thing. And there's just been no consequence on it because I guess it was a long time ago, so nobody cares anymore.
Yeah, so consistency is really what we need to talk about, isn't it? So 2019, Russia, they replaced Romania because Romania had a player who was not eligible because he'd played for another team in Rugby Sevens. Okay. But now we've got teams at this World Cup who have former Sevens players playing for them. So the eligibility changed from punishing one team to now rewarding other teams. So Spain were disqualified from that World Cup 2019 in the qualifiers. They were a good chance of qualifying. What happened was under 20s players, France under 20s players had played against Wales under 20, and they were playing for Spain. So that rule no longer exists.
Yeah, the under 20s doesn't capture people anymore as like a second 15 kind of thing, right?
Exactly. So it's controversial because others have freely selected under 20s players. So Wales took a case to the World Rugby, the IRB at the time, in 2012, because Stephen Shingler, who was Wales under 20 in 2011, was called up into the Scotland squad. So Wales argued that because they didn't have an active next to 15, that Shingle was their player attached via the under 20s, and Wales won. So Shingle never played for Scotland. And Wales did not like losing a player to Scotland, but again, there are a lot of under 20s players from other countries involved in Wales, past and present. So, for example, they went from that to then picking Gareth Anscombe. So he moved to Wales.
New Zealand under 20s.
Right. He was 23 years old when he moved. He played for New Zealand under 20s, the same tournament as Shingle was playing for Wales. So again, if you're Spanish, you're asking, what have we done wrong? So why is there no flexibility? What's going on here? So it was actually not because France under 20 players, but because it was against the Wales under 20, who were the next to 15. So that was the issue then. But before looking at 2023 in Spain, just mention 1999 quickly. So you talked about Scotland with Dave Hilton, and grandparent qualified, but in fact was not Scottish. Shane Howarth, Brett Sinskin for Wales, they were grandparent qualified, but actually they weren't eligible either.
Right.
So what happened to Wales and Scotland? Were they disqualified for the next World Cup? Right. So in fact, they didn't even need to qualify, but Russia were disqualified from the qualifiers for eligibility abuse. This South African player wasn't eligible.
Hmm.
So Spain's 2023 disqualifications, you're correct. It's Gavin Vandenberg. He played for Spain. It meant that the two matches saw Spain's points on the table zeroed. So Spain lost 10 points. I mean,
and if
yes,
I remember rightly, those matches that he participated in were ones that Spain mopped the floor. Was it like with the Netherlands or something?
correct.
So it's not like he was like some difference maker who came off the bench and like, you know, scored a hat trick of tries and was the difference. There were
43-0, 52-7. Exactly.
And then to go from that to having all the points deducted, it just seems like such a massive punishment, given the history of, like we said, just about how many other times it's kind of been let go.
Exactly. So he'd been outside of Spain for longer than the 60 days permitted per year during the residency period. So Spain, of course, actually played against Scotland, against Hilton in '99. So does that mean that the history books need to show Spain won that match by disqualification? What about Howarth and Sinkinson? I mean, they played in every match for Wales at that World Cup too. So they're pretty quiet on that. There was Italians surfaced from the past 4 World Cups as not being eligible. They are on record on video saying it. This was brought to the attention of World Rugby and just totally ignored. So, I mean, World Rugby.
It's so long ago they just decide not to care anymore. It's easier to brush it sweep it under the carpet.
So the independent committee, they found that Vandenberg was not eligible for Spain, and they actually asked him when he decided that Spain was his home. They said, was it less than 3 years before your debut? And he confirmed yes, and that was it. So you've got James Lowe saying eligibility laws are stupid 5 months before he plays for Ireland. Duhan van der Merwe said he likes going home to George, South Africa City, of course, every year. He said that months before being picked for his debut cap for Scotland. Okay. With Romania from this World Cup qualifying, the player you mentioned is Jason Tomani. So, yes, there are similarities between him and Spain and Gavin Vandenberg. So what happened is that his wife, Tomani's wife, posted on Instagram details showing that she was outside of Romania for more than the 60 days that are permitted per year. So the difference that we uncovered is that World Rugby were okay with it because they'd been consulted, and they hadn't been consulted with in the case of Spain and Vandenberg. So there are many who have said that Vandenberg lied to World Rugby about his passport and about the comprehension of the laws. So regardless, look, we've had cheating at past World Cups, but now the laws mean that former Australia, former England players can play for those two teams that broke the laws in the past. So look, I've had talks with a man who was working for Spain Rugby, and they were horrified. They couldn't believe the outcome. They said, it's una locura. It's crazy. So I'm not going to say the person's name, but a high-profile former player. He said, if anyone's from Argentina listening, they're going to understand. It's un papelón todo. So they think that the eligibility laws being simplified or just absolutely pure insanity.
Seems rough, man. Just for Spain. Like, I remember seeing the celebration photos of those guys when they finally won qualification, and it was glorious. And then,
absolutely. And look, they had a high number of players who are from France, from Argentina, from South Africa. That's the reality. But that was going to be a springboard. World Rugby recently, this week, released information about the strongest growing markets. Well, Spain was top of the list. So Spain very much think that World Rugby made a total error. They could have handled it like they handled Romania with.
Yeah, it seems
Jason
like it would have
Tomani.
made more sense in the situation. I don't know. It just for me sitting here on the outside, given the context of those games, and I don't know.
Yeah, well, Spain they think that rugby's a Commonwealth sport. They think that World Rugby is not World Rugby; it's British. So if you're interested in the global game, I mean, Uruguay are among the most improved teams in the last 10 years.
For sure.
And
I think a lot of people will get behind them after their escapades at the last World Cup, like their achievements. So I feel like they're going to be one of those kind of second teams for a lot of people. And Chile, I mean, just as an underdog story, I think a lot of people will get behind.
Absolutely. Look, Portugal is going to be great to watch. And very exciting. And their pool, of course. I mean, I don't want to predict that one.
Very tasty.
Yes. Mark,
do you have a prediction for the World Cup?
Well,
who does your heart want to win it? Who's your head thinks going to win it?
Well, I think we know that the teams are not evenly distributed. So if I had to, I'd say France would win, but I could just as easily say South Africa. I would say Ireland and New Zealand are third and fourth in that order.
Sure.
But I don't know. I'm looking at the group stage and not really thinking beyond that. I'd like
Argentina side of the draw, maybe a decent little run for them.
Yep, I think they're favorites to win that group. Group C, I legitimately don't know.
That's hard to pick.
I don't know. It could be Fiji. It could be Wales. It could be Australia. Georgia can also make it through.
Yeah.
I don't know. I do feel for teams that have like Italy. I mean,
Italy's probable. They always get the bloody All Blacks. It's really brutal for them. Like, can't they just have a World Cup where they don't have to play the All Blacks, please?
Yeah, would be nice. Well, 24 teams, hopefully, 6 polls, round of 16.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, that might be nice. What about the stated tier 2 things? I mean, like just generally. I mean, we're just talking about how some of these pools are hard to predict. Do you think it's like, are things getting closer between the teams if this Nations League goes ahead, where it's going to be the Rugby Championship teams, the Six Nations teams, and a couple of guests? Is that going to further, like, if the gap is closing, is that going to bring things back out?
It will, unfortunately. Hope that idea gets canned, and that we may be at a similar stage, crossroads, so to speak, like we were before 2007. Like P-Shot told his players, we've got to win. We've got to beat France. We've got to go far in this World Cup, because no one, I'm not going to use the words, but you know what I'm going to say. No one is interested in us. So where are we now? It's similar in that regard. Georgia, and they're not going to get Six Nations admission unless somehow they pay their way to play in it. So how are we going to help this grow somehow? Well, the positive news is that this time we're not having teams with 3-day turnarounds.
That's true.
I mean, I got tickets for the South Africa USA match in London, and what a waste of money. I wanted my money back. South Africa, Brian Habano was awesome, but I mean, the Eagles played basically a B-side aside from the captain, who was Samo Manoa that day, but we're not going to have that this time, or at least we should not have it this time. So
the competition's a lot more spaced out, isn't it? It's going to take longer, but that's not a bad thing.
Right. So I mean, look, Tonga will benefit tremendously for more days. Portugal will, Georgia will, Uruguay will, everybody. I do wonder what the top teams are going to do. Are they going to protect some of their players or not? So it's more intriguing based on that. For just as a side note, Chile, they're very much focused on Japan because that's their first match, and then on Argentina for historical purposes. So Argentina are also going to be very excited about the Chileans. So it's going to be interesting who plays. I don't think we're going to see that many hat tricks, for example, compared to the prior World Cup, because I just simply think the defense will be much better. But there might be a lot of people complaining about the line-out maul moves.
It's it's never been the most popular with people who want to see more of the razzle dazzle. Now, just before we wrap up, the America's Rugby News is the website that you help run. Personally, I know I've used it obviously for these, foreign-born players videos, very insightful. Also, I've used it for like just insights into some of the squads that I'm not that familiar with. Like I don't sit here watching South American rugby. I don't follow the South American like Super Rugby competition. But yeah, it's been great for me to kind of get like player profiles and whatnot on guys that I'm not that familiar with. But tell the folks what the deal is with the website and what else is on there.
Yeah, so we cover Americas from the snow in the north of Canada to the snow in the south of Argentina and Chile. So it started off as a project of three of us. Now we were individually covering Canada, US, and Argentina in essence. We just thought, let's do a Pan-American thing. And that started in 2015. And then along came America's Rugby Championship. And then along came, Pro Rugby as it was, and now Major League Rugby, now Super Rugby America. So there's endless initiatives happening. And just covering it all, it does occupy time. But we're able to keep it rolling. And hopefully it's a source of information for people wanting to learn a bit.
Yeah, I definitely can recommend it because certainly South American rugby doesn't have a heck of a lot of English content, so it's great for that. And I mean, the MLR and whatnot doesn't get just a heck of a lot of mainstream coverage. So I find it a great resource. I'll put a link down in the description to everybody to check it out, particularly the foreign-born players article, which I think, as I said, is always a bit of a hot button one. But yeah, man, cheers, Paul, for your time. It was good to catch up. And yeah, we'll see if your predictions about the World Cup pan out. Nobody's picking Ireland yet that I've talked to, so we'll see if we can get someone to pick Ireland.
Oh, Danny had me on his show, and he's from Limerick. He's very sure it's Ireland. So
there we go. Someone's
there you go.
Ireland. All right, man. Good to catch up with you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Cheers, man.